Coming up on Cannabis Coast to Coast News this week, it's a spooky weekend for adults to dress up and do what all adults like to do. Get in costume, act like kids, trick or treat with their favorite plant. The Summit Lounge in Worcester, Mass, always a high time. And with days to go before the 2024 vote, the question remains, which candidate will deliver the reform the industry wants and needs? VP Kamala Harris brings out the heavyweights for the final push, a virtual rally with Willie Nelson, Bruce Springsteen, and former President Barack Obama.
The next President of the United States of America, Vice President Kamala Harris.
So will that give her the edge over former President Donald Trump? What impact will the result have on federal reform anyway? Plus, the battle over Delta 8 hemp and Texas medical cannabis heads into the next legislative session in the Lone Star State. And a major recall of moldy products in Maine for a Massachusetts-based distributor, while the Bay State passes $6 billion in sales revenue. And Snoop Dogg admits to consuming 81 blunts a day while employing a staffer to monitor the intake of his entourage. And which gender do you think buys more weed? Now, it's a 50-50 shot, but buying weed from women is more than a brand. It's now the dominant gender when it comes to the product. And bidding begins in Colorado for vanity plates celebrating that state's pro-cannabis laws. All that and state reports from coast to coast on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Elena Pinto. Next.
We are Pro-Cannabis Media.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of Cannabis Coast to Coast News, Pro-Cannabis Media's weekly roundup of cannabis news from the industry. I'm Elena Pinto, and if you want to have the show available for you anytime on your mobile device, just download the app PCM TV from the App Store or Google Play, and you can have this content on demand. The QR code on the screen will take you right there. Our top story continues to be focused on the presidential election that takes place in just over a week on November 5th, but early voting has begun and the two candidates continue to work the campaign trail in the battleground states of Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Nevada. All told, there are 93 electoral votes up for grabs in those states where polls indicate a dead heat. One state that used to be a battleground state, Georgia, is where VP Kamala Harris hosted a virtual live-streamed rally with some heavy hitters from entertainment like Bruce Springsteen and former President Barack Obama.
And the good news is, we've got a candidate to vote for in this election who demonstrates that kind of character, who knows what real strength looks like, who will set a good example and do the right thing and leave this country better than she found it. That is what this election is about. And that is why it is my honor to introduce my friend, the next President of the United States of America, Vice President Kamala Harris.
So you all may know, it was 17 years ago. It was over 17 years ago when I took a trip to Springfield, Illinois. It was a cold February day. And I went there to support this brilliant young senator who was running for president of the United States. And millions of Americans were energized and inspired, not only by Barack Obama's message, but by how he leads, seeking to unite rather than separate us. And that is why in 2007, I went New Year's Eve to Iowa to knock on doors in the snow. And all these years later, Barack Obama I say to you, your friendship and your faith in me and in our campaign means the world. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President.
In Texas, former President Donald Trump made an appearance at a rally in Austin, but it was in San Antonio on Thursday night when an election official was assaulted upon leaving the facility where early votes were being counted. She was shaken up, but returned home safely. To call Texas a battleground state is an understatement, considering the mixed legal approach towards cannabis. Hemp-derived products from Delta 8 dominate the market, while a physician-based medical program exists for about a dozen diagnoses. And now the medical cannabis industry and the Delta 8 hemp industry will be battling at the Texas State House as Dallas and other Texas cities vote to decriminalize cannabis despite the wishes of their governor and attorney general. Here's our Texas correspondent, Lisa Williams, with more.
I'm Lisa Williams, founder of the Toke Agency, bringing you the Texas Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. All right, things are heating up fast in the Lone Star State, and Texas, while it remains one of the few states with broad marijuana legalization, it's clear the cannabis conversation is booming, especially around hemp and its more intoxicating relatives, Delta 8 and Delta 9 THC. Right now, Texas is facing a bit of a dilemma. The state's medical marijuana program, known as the Compassionate Use Program, has been a lifeline for around 12,000 patients, offering low THC cannabis to treat conditions like epilepsy, PTSD, and cancer. But with only 3 dispensaries to cover this entire massive state, many are finding it hard to get access to the medicine that they need. Meanwhile, the hemp industry is flourishing in Texas, offering products like Delta 8 and Delta 9 THC in gummies, oils, and edibles, for which many deliver a similar experience to marijuana. Here's where it gets a little tricky. Because these hemp products fall into this legal gray area, they're largely unregulated. That raises concern about safety, with some reports of the products containing harmful contaminants like pesticides and heavy metals. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has called for stricter regulations, and lawmakers eyeing everything from age limits to mandatory testing. But banning these products outright, that's a big no for most Texans. Many, including veterans, prefer these hemp products because they're cheaper and easier to get than the highly regulated medical cannabis. It's this balancing act between making sure the products are safe and keeping them accessible for those who depend on them. So, as we look towards the next legislative session in 2025, Texas lawmakers will have to decide: tighten the reins on the hemp industry, expand the medical marijuana access, or just keep trying to juggle both. What about just making cannabis legal in the state of Texas? Stay tuned, folks. This is a wild ride, and we're just getting started. I'm Lisa Williams, founder of the Toke Agency, bringing you the Texas Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
There was a major fine imposed on a small illegal cannabis operation in upstate New York this past week. The dispensary, called Jadega, had been warned multiple times over the past few years to stop operations. A cease and desist notice was sent out last summer and was ignored by their owner-operator, George West. Now, he is facing a fine of $9.5 million for ignoring many attempts for him to close his doors. In June of 2023, a raid confiscated over 200 pounds of cannabis and ordered him to shut his doors. He did not, so now he's facing one of the largest fines issued in any state against a single unlicensed store. It was in June of this year that West was ordered to shut down his store again, and now he's got a huge fine to pay that state that has now banned him from operating anywhere in New York. But it's not all bad news in the New York State, where the social equity world will be getting some sorely needed operational capital. Here's Pam Schmiel with more from the Big Apple.
This is Cannabis Coast to Coast News, and I'm Pam Schmiel reporting from New York. The New York City Cannabis Loan Fund was recently launched to help licensed social equity businesses in New York City get access to capital. A previous fund, supported by the Chicago Atlantic Investment Group, was accused of corruption, where state senators ultimately called for an investigation and demanded the state cease making any loan deals with Chicago Atlantic. Everyone's hoping better success with the new loan. And New York City's Cannabis Control Board recently approved a big merger with RIV Capital and Consortium, a vertically integrated operation in Florida with the Fluent dispensaries. And according to a Benzinga article, the merger is expected to close by the end of 2024, positioning the company to have 25% of the U.S. market share, with 8 cultivation and processing facilities and 42 dispensaries spread out across 4 states, including New York. And CBS News is reporting that New York City Sheriff Anthony Miranda is facing more questions over his department's seizure of cash during raids on illegal cannabis storefronts. So far, over 27,000 pounds of cannabis has been seized. And the New York City Council is also demanding records from the sheriff's office because they want to know exactly how much money his office took from these smoke shops. More on this as it unfolds. In the meantime, it's Pam Schmiel reporting from New York for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
The state of New Mexico is the center of a lawsuit by 8 legal cannabis operators against the Biden administration and the U.S. Customs and Border Control operating in that state. Our correspondent in Washington, D.C., Andrew Behringer, has that story, including some details of the inhumane treatment of some of the drivers of the vehicles that were delivering legal cannabis to legal operators.
I'm Andrew Behringer with the Washington, D.C. report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. With Election Day approaching, cannabis reform continues to make headlines across the United States. Recent polls show that 88% of Americans now favor legal cannabis for either medical or adult use, with support crossing from both party lines. Both former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris support easing restrictions, reflecting a broader shift in political attitudes than recent past. While Democrats champion personal freedom and regulated access, Republican opposition has softened significantly, with only 17% supporting complete prohibition. Now, this November, 4 states, Florida, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota, will be able to vote on cannabis legalization in their respective state. Good luck, and please don't forget to vote. In different news, though, in New Mexico, 8 licensed New Mexico cannabis companies are filing a federal lawsuit, which happened on October 22nd against the United States Customs and Border Patrol Protection Agency and the Department of Homeland Security. Now, this lawsuit alleges unconstitutional seizures of legal cannabis products and unlawful detention of industry workers, with damages exceeding over $1 million. Now, according to this filing, Customs Border Patrol adopted a new policy in 2024 specifically targeting New Mexico's legal cannabis operations, despite similar business operating legally in other border states like Arizona and California. The companies report employees being detained and fingerprinted before release without charges, along with the seizure of personal vehicles. Now, while Congress limits federal interference with medical cannabis programs, these restrictions do not extend to the adult use operations of the cannabis industry currently. The lawsuit seeks documentation of seized property, compensation for losses, and establishment of a formal process for challenging future seizures. The plaintiffs argue that this enforcement actions not only disrupt business operations, but also contradict the federal policy of non-interference with state legal cannabis programs. Now, potentially undermining New Mexico's regulatory framework and inadvertently benefiting the illicit market. Well, that's the Washington Report. I'm Andrew Barringer, reporting for Coast to Coast, Cannabis Coast to Coast News. See you next week.
As long as cannabis remains a Schedule I substance, according to the CSA, the conflict between federal and state law will always cause challenges to operators. That's happening in many states, and as our Colorado correspondent Xavier Gillet explains, until the feds figure out what schedule, if any, to put cannabis on, the conflict between the feds and states will continue.
Hi everyone, my name is Xavier Gillet. I am the chair of the Colorado chapter of the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce, and I'm also a non-attorney professional at the McDonald Hopkins law firm. And I'm this week's Colorado correspondent for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I've got two stories to report on today. One of them is a little bit more fun, and the other one's a little bit more serious. I do like ending on a bit of a funner note, so we'll start with the more serious story. And that is that the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, it's the federal agency responsible for overseeing and administering provisions of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that of course prevents discrimination against employees for various disabilities. Now, cannabis operators, I think, typically like to believe that they operate outside of the purview of federal law and agencies because they distribute and are engaged in a business that is federally illegal. Now, as I reported on when it came to OSHA in another employee-related case a few weeks back, here we have a situation where a federal agency is indeed issuing a fine and a determination against a dispensary for, again, improperly firing an employee. Now, what this means and the impact of this is that it's a stark reminder that cannabis operators here in Colorado are still subject to federal oversight and regulation from agencies, regardless of how they believe the federal governments treat the products, cannabis, that they're primarily engaged in selling. And a reminder, again, underscoring the ever important component, let's say, of cannabis, that compliance is king. And typically people think of regulatory compliance, they think of labels, packaging, product potency. But at the end of the day, these businesses do employ employees, and in the eye of federal agencies, as we've seen with this case, those employees are deserving of the same protections that employees in, let's say, non-federally illegal businesses get. Now, the second story, like I said, is a bit of a funner one, being that the state of Colorado has renewed its program issuing license plates to residents that are cannabis themed. Now, this is a special program. There's a limited number of license plates, but every year residents are able to bid on the right to use these license plates. The license plates contain terms that are related to cannabis, like reefer or high life or 420, fun phrases indicating, let's say, passion or participation in the cannabis industry. And these proceeds are then used for various social justice efforts around the state. Now, this program has been in place since 2021, and while in the grand scheme of government spending, it may not seem like much, the program has raised over $100,000, and Colorado intends to continue offering the cannabis-themed vanity plates to residents for years to come. That's it from Colorado this week. Again, my name is Xavier Gillet, and I'm looking forward to bringing you some news at next week's update.
That will do it for the A Block this week, but we have a lot more to get to, including the latest adventures of Snoop Dogg, who shares what his daily consumption of the plant medicine is like. Plus, the news from California on one coast to Massachusetts on this coast. Cannabis Coast to Coast News continues after this.
I'm Joe Parsons with the Virginia Cannabis Connection. And this is Bob. And this is the Virginia Cannabis Report on Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Ready to take your craft to the next level? Imagine faster extractions, purer products, and more profits. Sounds good, right? At Pure 5 Extraction, we've revolutionized cannabis extraction with our game-changing technology. No solvents, no heat, just the cleanest, most natural process on the market. Whether you're a boutique grower or a large-scale operation, Pure 5 has the tools to elevate your business worldwide. Visit pure5extraction.com today. Pure 5 Extraction, because your plants deserve the best.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.